I've seen a lot in my time as a police officer: the violent crimes, the heart-wrenching calls, the strange things that don't make sense. But there's one night that still stands out among all the others. A night I can't forget. I don't think I ever will. It was a Friday, just around midnight. I was working alone on patrol, and the city was quieter than usual. The only sounds were the occasional car passing by, the buzz of the streetlights, and the faint hum of my cruiser's radio. The air was thick with humidity, and it felt like a storm was brewing. Though the sky was clear, a deep black blanket scattered with stars. I had just finished a routine traffic stop when the call came through. Unit 6, we have a 10 to 56 in the warehouse district. Reports of a suspicious vehicle. Can you respond? The warehouse district wasn't somewhere I wanted to be at that hour. That part of town had seen better days. Broken down buildings, dark alleys, and abandoned warehouses. It wasn't a place you wanted to be caught alone, especially at 2 a.m. I hesitated for a moment. It was a routine call, or so I thought. A parked car in an odd spot, maybe a break-in or a stolen vehicle. But something about the dispatcher's tone felt off, urgent. Or maybe I was just being paranoid. Either way, I accepted the call and made my way to the location, my cruiser's headlights cutting through the fog rolling in from the nearby river. When I arrived, I saw the vehicle, an old, beat-up sedan parked in front of one of the warehouses. Its engine was off, and the lights were dim. At first glance, it looked like just another abandoned car someone's junk left to rust. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange. The car's windows were fogged up from the inside. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I approached the car cautiously, flashlight in hand. I swept the beam across the windows and saw nothing at first, just an empty back seat littered with old wrappers and a fast food cup. But then something moved. Just a slight shift in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat. I tapped on the window with my flashlight. "Hey, step out of the vehicle." I called out, louder than usual. No response, no sound, nothing. "Unit 6 to dispatch," I said into my radio. "I've got a suspicious vehicle, no contact with the occupant. Requesting backup." I took a step back, circling the car as I scanned the area around me. The tension in the air felt suffocating, as though the fog itself was pressing in. Then I saw a strange smudge on the back window. It looked like a handprint, but it was oddly perfect, almost too clean, as though it had been deliberately made. Leaning closer, I tried to make sense of it, and that's when I saw him. Inside the car, slumped against the passenger side window, was a man. He looked to be in his late 20s, wearing a dark hoodie. His face was pale, almost gray, with lips slightly parted. But it was his eyes that froze me. They were wide open, staring directly at me, unblinking. For a split second, I thought he was dead. Then I saw his chest rise and fall in shallow, deliberate breaths. "Hey," I yelled, more urgently this time, tapping on the window again. "Are you okay? Talk to me." No response. No movement. He just stared, his breath fogging up the glass in short, rhythmic bursts. "Unit 6 to dispatch," I said, my voice strained. "I have a possible medical emergency. I need backup at my location. Subject is unresponsive." As I spoke, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I've handled dozens of similar calls, but this felt different. The air seemed heavier, and my stomach churned with unease. I couldn't wait for backup. I had to check on him. I pulled the door handle, and the door creaked open with an unsettling groan. My hand instinctively rested on my holster as I stepped back. Inside, the man's body swayed slightly, as though he'd been propped up for hours. His eyes remained wide open, but they were vacant, lifeless. I reached out to check for a pulse, my fingers brushing the back of his neck. That's when I felt it, a sticky, slick substance. Blood. I jerked my hand away, my heart pounding. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Outside the car, in the dust near the door, was a second set of footprints, small, almost childlike. They led to the car but didn't match the man's shoes. I scanned the area, my flashlight darting through the fog. Nothing. But then I heard a faint rustling sound, like soft footsteps, coming from the other side of the car. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the haze. There was nothing there, just shadows and fog. My pulse quickened, my mind racing. I was trained for dangerous situations, but this felt wrong, deeply wrong. Unit 6 to dispatch, I said again, my voice shaking. We've got a situation here. Subject is unresponsive, possibly deceased, and... Before I could finish, the sound came again, closer this time. A soft, deliberate scraping noise, like something being dragged along the ground. I turned, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the fog stood a figure. It was tall, its outline hazy and indistinct, blending into the shadows around it. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze on me watching. The air seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain, thick and suffocating. I didn't wait to find out what it was. Adrenaline surged through me as I bolted back to my cruiser. I slammed the door shut, locking it, and sped off without a second glance. When backup arrived, the car was empty. The man was gone. The bloodstains were dry, almost faded, as though they'd been there for days. The footprints, gone. The area was searched thoroughly, but no evidence was found, no sign of a struggle, no sign of the figure I'd seen in the fog. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I don't know who or what I encountered that night. All I know is that it wasn't normal, and I'm not going back to the warehouse district again. Whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. I've been with the Chicago Police Department for nearly 20 years now, and I've seen things that most people wouldn't believe. When you've been on the force as long as I have, you learn to expect the unexpected. But there was one night about 8 years ago that still sends chills down my spine whenever I think about it. I've never talked about it before, not at the station, not to my family, not to anyone. But maybe putting it down here will help me make sense of what happened. Or maybe it won't. Either way, it's a story I'll never forget. It was late November, one of those brutally cold Chicago nights where the wind off Lake Michigan cuts right through you. I was working the night shift, partnered with a rookie named Danny. He was a good kid, eager to prove himself, full of that youthful energy I used to have before the job wore it out of me. We were assigned to the west side, patrolling neighborhoods where crime was an unfortunate part of life. We had just finished responding to a domestic disturbance call that turned out to be nothing more than a couple arguing over money. It was around 2 a.m. when we got a call from dispatch about a possible break-in at an old apartment complex over on North Lawndale Avenue. This wasn't unusual. The area was known for squatters and drug activity. But something in the dispatcher's voice was off. She sounded nervous, almost hesitant, like she was afraid to send us out there. Danny and I didn't think much of it at the time. Strange calls at odd hours were part of the job. We pulled up to the address, an old, dilapidated building that looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. The windows were broken, the paint was peeling, and the whole place reeked of decay. The street was eerily quiet, without even the usual city sounds. Creepy place, Danny said, giving me a half smile. You ever been here before? I shook my head. Not in a long time. It used to be a halfway house for recovering addicts, but it got shut down years ago. Haven't had a reason to come back since. We stepped out of the car, the cold biting at our faces, and I radioed in our location. I didn't expect anything serious, maybe just some homeless folks trying to escape the cold. But as we approached the building, I noticed something strange. The front door was wide open, swaying slightly in the wind. There were no signs of forced entry, but it felt like an invitation we were better off refusing. Flashlights in hand, we stepped inside. The building smelled of mold and rot, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes long after you've left. The lobby was empty except for some old furniture covered in dust. Then, from somewhere deeper inside, we heard a faint noise. It sounded like a woman's voice, whispering something I couldn't quite make out. "You hear that?" Danny whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's check it out." We moved down the hallway, the sound of our boots echoing off the walls. The whispering grew louder, but it didn't sound like just one person. It was like a dozen voices speaking at once, overlapping, saying things I couldn't understand. My pulse quickened, and I saw Danny's hand shaking as he gripped his flashlight tighter. We reached a stairwell, and the voices seemed to be coming from below, deep in the basement. I turned to Danny. "You stay here, cover the entrance," I told him. He looked relieved, which in hindsight was probably the right instinct, but I was the senior officer, and I couldn't let a rookie take point on something like this. I made my way down the narrow staircase, the air growing colder with every step. It felt like I was descending into another world, one that didn't belong in this reality. The basement was pitch black, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. Then, as I reached the bottom, the voices stopped just like that. Silence. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring, like they're straining to hear something that isn't there. I turned slowly, trying to get my bearings, when I noticed something odd. At the far end of the basement was a door. It looked newer than the rest of the building, made of heavy steel with no handle, just a small rectangular slot at the top, like something you'd see in an asylum or a prison cell. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I was about to turn back and call for backup when a noise erupted from behind the door, a guttural, animalistic scream that sent me stumbling back. It was a sound no human should be able to make, filled with rage and pain and something else I couldn't place. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. "Officer, you all right down there?" Danny's voice crackled through the radio, startling me. "I'm fine," I lied, trying to steady my breathing. "Just stay where you are." I felt compelled to look through the slot in the door, though every instinct screamed at me to leave. I shined my flashlight through it, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There was a man or something that used to be a man inside. His eyes were wide and crazed. His skin stretched tight over his bones like he hadn't eaten in weeks. He wore what looked like a hospital gown, stained with dried blood and filth, but his eyes, they were black, completely black, like staring into the void. He lunged at the slot, slamming into the door with a force that shook the frame, screaming in a language I didn't understand. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. In the brief moment of darkness, I heard chains rattling, multiple chains, as if there were more of them behind the door. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed my flashlight, and ran back up the stairs. When I reached the lobby, Danny was gone. The front door was wide open, and there was no sign of him. I called his name, checked every room, but he had vanished. I radioed for backup, my voice trembling, but all I got was static. Then the radio crackled to life, not with dispatch, but with Danny's voice whispering the same gibberish I'd heard in the basement. I dropped the radio and ran to the cruiser, peeling out as fast as I could. When we returned with a full team, the building was different. The basement door was gone, replaced with a solid brick wall. There was no sign of Danny, no sign of anything I had seen that night. The official report says Officer Daniel Hayes went missing in the line of duty, presumed dead. But I know that's not what happened. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that basement. Sometimes I still hear Danny's voice on the radio, just a faint whisper, static, and the sound of chains rattling. Every year, on the anniversary of that night, I get a call on my personal phone. The number is untraceable. No one speaks, but I can hear that same guttural whispering before the line goes dead. I've moved on, taken a desk job, trying to live a normal life. But deep down I know that one day, whatever I left behind in that basement will come for me. And when it does, I don't think I'll escape a second time. I've been with the force for over 12 years, and in that time I've seen things that still haunt me. Patrolling the streets, responding to calls, and witnessing the worst of what people can do to each other. I thought I'd seen it all. But one incident stands out above all others as the most unsettling. It wasn't a murder, robbery, or violent crime. It wasn't something I could easily explain, and the terror I felt that night still lingers with me. It was close to 3 a.m. when the call came in. I was working solo that night. My partner had called in sick. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual hum of distant traffic absent in our small town. I had just finished a report in my patrol car, parked outside the diner, when the dispatcher's voice broke through the radio. "Unit 15, we have a 10 to 74. Possible disturbance at 2314 Hollowbrook Lane. Female caller sounds distressed. No further details at this time. Can you respond?" I grabbed the mic, acknowledging the call. Hollowbrook Lane wasn't far, just a few blocks away. I wasn't expecting anything major, maybe another noise complaint or an argument that had gotten out of hand. Still, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in my gut. Something about the dispatcher's slightly strained tone gave me pause. When I pulled up to the house, it was exactly what I'd expected. A small, two-story house tucked away in the woods, barely visible under the canopy of trees. A streetlight stood far enough down the road that the porch was left in deep shadow. The windows were dark, and the front door stood slightly ajar, as if someone had hurried inside without closing it. I radioed at my arrival and got out of the car, trying to keep my movement steady. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, but I brushed it off as nerves. There's always a sense of unease responding to a call in the middle of the night, especially one involving a distressed caller. I approached the door cautiously, knocking firmly. "Police, is anyone home? Are you all right?" No answer. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I tried the door handle, finding it unlocked. That made my stomach drop. Most people, when scared or waiting for police, lock their doors. An unlocked door? That was strange. I pushed the door open slowly, announcing myself again. "Police, I'm coming in." The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a darkened interior. The air inside was unnaturally cold, and the faint smell of stale food and dust hung in the air. My hand instinctively moved closer to my holster as I stepped inside. The house was silent, eerily so. No shouting, no signs of a struggle, nothing out of place. The living room was cluttered with old furniture and stacks of magazines, but it felt untouched, like time had paused there. I moved cautiously down the hallway, shining my flashlight into each room I passed. The bedrooms were empty. The bathroom was unoccupied. Even the kitchen was undisturbed. Then I came to the last door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, and through the gap, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the room. At first I thought it was the woman who had called, but as I got closer I realized it was a man. He was tall, thin, and wearing a dark hoodie. He stood unnaturally still, facing the wall. His posture was stiff, almost mechanical, as if he were frozen in place. "Sir, are you okay?" I called out, keeping my voice steady. "I'm Officer Carter. I'm here to help." He didn't move. I called again, this time more firmly. "Sir, turn around. I need to speak with you." Still nothing. His silence was deafening. My heart started pounding faster. Something was off, terribly off. I stepped closer, my boots scuffing softly against the hardwood floor. As I approached, I noticed something about him that made my blood run cold. His posture was all wrong, too rigid, as if he were mimicking a person but not quite getting it right. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and his shoulders were locked in place. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. "Sir, this is your last warning," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Turn around and let me see your hands." The figure turned slowly, and I immediately regretted not drawing my weapon earlier. His eyes, they were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just endless voids that seemed to pull all the light out of the room. I staggered back, struggling to keep my balance. A chill ran down my spine as I took in his pale, sickly skin and the unnaturally wide grin stretching across his face. But he didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at me with those soulless eyes. I knew I had to get out of there. Whatever was happening wasn't normal. I raised my hand to call for backup, but the radio was dead, just static, no voice responding. The silence in the house was suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. I began backing away, my hand still clutching my gun. "You need to stay back." "I'm leaving," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the panic rising in my chest. The man didn't move. He just stood there, grinning, his black eyes locked onto mine. I turned and walked toward the front door, every instinct screaming at me to run. Just as I stepped over the threshold, I heard him speak. His voice was low, distorted, inhuman. "You shouldn't have come here." That was enough. I ran to my car, not looking back. I slammed the door, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel. I didn't stop until I was back at the station. When my captain asked me what happened, I couldn't explain it. I told him the house was empty, that it had been a false alarm, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day, I decided to go back. Maybe I could find a clue, something to make sense of it. But when I arrived, the house was completely abandoned. The front door was locked, the windows shut, and there was no sign of anyone. The furniture was gone, and the house felt hollow, as if it had been empty for years. I still don't know who or what I saw that night. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face, those black eyes, that cold, unnatural smile. I try to tell myself it wasn't real, but deep down, I know the truth. Maybe I wasn't supposed to be there that night. Maybe I wasn't supposed to leave. I've been a police officer for over 12 years, but even now I can't explain what happened that night. It's not the kind of thing you can chalk up to stress or an overactive imagination. No, this was something else, something that still haunts me and that I'll never fully understand. It was a quiet shift, the kind that usually doesn't amount to more than a few calls for noise complaints or minor traffic incidents. That is, until I got a call that changed everything. It was late around 2 a.m. The streets were deserted, and a steady rain had started to fall, adding an eerie stillness to the night. I was working solo that evening, and the night had been uneventful so far. Then my sergeant's voice crackled through the radio. "Unit 5, we've got a disturbance call on 7th Avenue. Female caller sounds frantic. Possible home invasion. Can you take it?" I acknowledged the call and started driving toward the address. Disturbance calls weren't unusual, and I expected it to be another routine situation. But something about the dispatcher's voice didn't sit right with me. There was an edge to it, a hesitation. As I drove down 7th Avenue, the rain intensified, and the street lights began to flicker, casting fleeting shadows across the wet pavement. The neighborhood was silent, too silent. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like something is watching, waiting. When I pulled up to 20,125 7th Avenue, the house was dark. There were no signs of movement, no lights, but the front door was slightly ajar. That immediately set off alarm bells in my mind. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped out of the car, and approached the house cautiously. "Police. Is anyone inside? We've received a distress call," I called out, my voice cutting through the rain. No response. I knocked on the door frame, louder this time, but still there was nothing. My gut told me something wasn't right. Normally, if someone's scared enough to call the police, they lock the door. But this door wasn't just unlocked, it was wide open. "Unit 5 on scene," I radioed in. "Doors open, no response. Going in to investigate." I pushed the door open, flashlight in hand, and stepped inside. The air was unnaturally cold, the kind of chill that doesn't come from weather alone. Almost immediately, I caught a faint metallic scent, familiar but unplaceable. Not quite blood, but close. "Hello? Police?" I called again, my voice echoing through the house. The floor creaked beneath my boots as I moved down a narrow hallway, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Family photos lined the walls, but something about them felt off. The faces seemed to follow me as I passed, their eyes glinting eerily in the beam of my light. I entered the living room and stopped. It was empty save for a few pieces of furniture and a heavy coat draped over a chair. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of anyone. But then I saw it, a fresh handprint smeared on the front window, visible through the rain. The print was too high to belong to a child, and too large to be from most women. A chill ran down my spine. "Dispatch, I need backup at 20125 7th Avenue, I said, my voice low and tense. "Something isn't right here." I moved through the house, clearing each room as I went. The kitchen, dining room, and bathroom were all empty, and yet the air felt heavy, oppressive. The house was silent except for the faint sound of rain against the windows. When I reached the staircase, I hesitated. The feeling that I was being watched grew stronger, and the cold seemed to deepen. My grip tightened on my flashlight as I slowly ascended the stairs, each creaking step amplifying the tension. At the top of the stairs, I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound. Footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. They weren't my footsteps. They were coming from the hallway ahead of me. I took a step forward, then another. The sound stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I turned toward the first bedroom at the top of the stairs. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I saw her. A woman sat on the floor, her back to me. She was dressed in a pristine white gown, her hair tangled and matted. Her breathing was shallow, her frame eerily still. "Mom?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Are you okay? Can you hear me?" She didn't move. I stepped closer, the beam of my flashlight catching the pallor of her skin. "Ma'am, I'm here to help," I said, though the unease in my voice was unmistakable. Slowly, I reached out to touch her shoulder. The moment my fingers brushed her gown, her head jerked to the side in an unnatural, snapping motion. Her face, her eyes were all wrong. Her eyes were black, completely devoid of whites or pupils. They were endless, hollow voids that seemed to draw me in. Her lips curled into a faint, eerie smile as she whispered in a raspy, inhuman voice. "Why did you come?" The words sent a cold dread through me, freezing me in place. Then she spoke again, her voice a low hiss that seemed to echo in my head. "You should have left when you had the chance." I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing. The air felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Without thinking, I turned and bolted. I didn't stop until I was outside, the rain pounding against my face as I reached my patrol car. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the keys. I drove straight to the station, my mind racing. When I reported what had happened, I tried to stay calm, but I could see the disbelief on my sergeant's face. Backup was sent to the house immediately, but they found nothing. No woman, no handprint, no signs of life. The house was completely empty, as if no one had lived there in years. There were no records of anyone at that address, no reports of a woman matching her description. It was as though she had never existed. They wrote it off as a hoax or a misunderstanding, but I knew better. I knew what I'd seen. I still can't explain what happened that night. I don't think I ever will, but every time I close my eyes, I see her, those black eyes, that faint, twisted smile, and her voice whispering in my head. "Why didn't you leave?" I haven't been back to that street since, and I avoid it whenever I'm on duty. But sometimes I think about the call, about the things I can't explain. And I know deep down that whatever was in that house is still out there, waiting for the next person to make the same mistake I did. I've been in law enforcement for nearly 15 years now, and I've seen my share of things that defy explanation. But there's one incident that haunts me to this day, something that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about my job and reality itself. This happened when I was still a young officer, fresh out of the academy and eager to make a difference. I was stationed in a rural part of northern Minnesota, in a small town where everyone knew everyone. But sometimes it's those small, quiet towns that hide the darkest secrets. It was late September, and I was working the night shift with my partner, Tom. We were the only officers on duty that night since the rest of the force had been called to assist with a major incident in the next county over. It was one of those nights where nothing much was happening, just the usual rounds and the occasional drunk stumbling out of the local bar. Then, around 2 a.m., we received a strange call on the radio. "Dispatch to Unit 5. We have a report of strange activity in the vicinity of Darnell," came the voice of our dispatcher, Gloria. I frowned. Darnell was an old ghost town about 30 miles out, abandoned since the 1960s when the local mining company shut down. No one lived there anymore. Hell, it wasn't even on most maps. "Copy that, dispatch," I said, looking over at Tom. He shrugged, as confused as I was. "Sounds like a prank," he muttered, but I could see the unease in his eyes. "Maybe," I replied, though I wasn't convinced. It was rare for anyone to mess with the police out here, especially in the dead of night. We decided to check it out anyway, partly because there was nothing else to do and partly out of sheer curiosity. We took the cruiser down the old highway, the road growing more desolate with every mile. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, making the night even darker. The radio crackled with static, and I had to turn it off after it started giving off a high-pitched squeal that made my skin crawl. Darnell wasn't far, but as we got closer, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut, the kind of feeling you get when you know something's wrong, but can't quite put your finger on it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we saw the rusted sign that read Darnell, population 0, and turned onto the narrow gravel road leading into town. The place was just as I'd heard, dilapidated buildings, broken windows, and streets overtaken by weeds. It was like stepping into another world, one that had been left behind and forgotten. As we drove deeper into the town, our headlights illuminated something that made my heart skip a beat. There were lights on in one of the old houses. "Isn't this place supposed to be abandoned?" Tom asked, eyes wide as he leaned forward in his seat. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. "No one's supposed to be here." I slowed the cruiser to a crawl, our headlights cutting through the darkness as we approached the house. It was one of those old Victorian homes, the kind that looked haunted even in broad daylight. The windows were grimy, the paint peeling, but there was definitely light coming from inside and not just a flickering bulb. It looked like the whole house was lit up with electricity, which made no sense given there was no power in Darnell. We parked the cruiser and got out, the crunch of gravel under our boots sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as we approached the front door, which was slightly ajar, creaking open with a soft push. "Police. Anyone here?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty hallways. There was no answer, just the soft hum of electricity, which made no sense in a town that had been off the grid for decades. We stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The interior was old, covered in dust, but it was like someone had been living there recently. Fresh footprints in the dust led deeper into the house. I gestured for Tom to follow me, and we cautiously made our way down the narrow hallway. Turning a corner, we came across a room that looked like it had been preserved in time. It was a living room, complete with old furniture, a fireplace, and a record player spinning silently. What really caught my attention, though, was the calendar on the wall. It was dated September 18, 1963. "What the hell?" Tom whispered, reaching for the calendar. I grabbed his arm. "Don't touch anything," I said, a cold fear gripping my chest. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from upstairs, like something heavy had been thrown to the floor. We both jumped, guns drawn, and I motioned for Tom to cover me as we slowly ascended the creaky staircase. As we reached the top, I noticed the air had grown colder, our breaths misting in the beam of our flashlights. We followed the noise to a room at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly open, and from within, we heard the faint sound of children laughing. But it wasn't the kind of laughter that brings joy, it was the kind that chills you to the bone. I kicked the door open, and what we saw made my blood run cold. The room was full of people, or rather, it had been full of people. Decayed bodies sat in chairs around a long table, their faces frozen in grotesque smiles, eyes wide open as if caught in a moment of shock or horror. The room smelled of rot and decay, but the bodies were dressed in pristine clothing, as if they had just sat down for a dinner party. Before we could process what we were seeing, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. "Tom, we need to get out of here," I hissed, panic rising in my throat. But Tom didn't respond. I turned my flashlight toward where he had been standing, only to find empty space. He was gone. "Tom, Tom," I shouted, my voice cracking, but there was no answer. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. That eerie, childlike laughter filled the room again, this time right behind me. I spun around, my flashlight flickering, but there was nothing there. I was alone. The darkness felt alive, suffocating me. I ran. I don't remember how I got out of that house, but the next thing I knew, I was stumbling into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The cruiser was still there, engine running, but Tom was nowhere to be found. I jumped in and sped out of there, gravel flying as I tore down the road back to town. When I got back to the station, I was shaking so badly I could barely speak. I told the sheriff everything, but when we returned to the house with a full team the next morning, it was different. No lights, no bodies, no signs of life, just an old abandoned house, empty and lifeless. There was no trace of Tom. The official report said he went missing in the line of duty, but I know what I saw. I tried to find answers, to make sense of what happened, but the more I dug, the more I realized Darnell was a place best left forgotten. Years later, I received an anonymous letter in the mail. It had no return address, just a single line written on old yellow paper: "You can never leave Darnell." I burned the letter, but I knew what it meant. Every now and then, I still hear that laughter in my dreams. And sometimes when I'm alone at night, I could swear I hear Tom calling my name, begging me to come back, but I never will. I've been a cop for over a decade, and in that time I thought I had seen everything a police officer could experience. I've witnessed the worst of humanity and faced situations that could have easily ended in disaster. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the night I spent alone in that house. It started as a simple call, a domestic disturbance. Maybe a little more than the usual noise complaint, but still, nothing out of the ordinary. What I experienced that night, however, shook me to my core. I have never been able to explain it. It was a Friday night in late September when the call came in. It was around 2 a.m., and I was working the night shift in a small, quiet town just outside Denver, Colorado. The radio crackled with the usual background noise before the dispatcher's voice came through, clear but slightly strained. "Officer Reynolds, we've got a report of a domestic disturbance at 1340 Willow Creek Road. The caller is a woman, sounds like she's in distress, requesting immediate assistance." Domestic disturbances weren't uncommon, especially on a Friday night. People drink, tempers flare, and sometimes things get out of hand. It's rarely anything we can't handle. I grabbed my gear and headed toward the address, expecting it to be a routine call, knock on the door, assess the situation, and make sure everyone was safe. The house was located on the outskirts of town, down a long, winding road that bordered the woods. I'd been out that way before, and it always felt eerie. The isolation, the dense trees, and the way the silence seemed to hang in the air, it was unsettling. But I didn't dwell on it. After all, it was just another call. When I arrived, the house stood in darkness, except for a few lights visible through the windows. It was strangely quiet, no shouting, no sounds of a struggle, just silence. I parked my car in the gravel driveway and approached the front door. That's when I noticed it. The door was slightly ajar. Odd. Most people close their doors even when they're expecting someone. I knocked, but there was no response. I knocked again, louder this time, still nothing. Unease began to creep in. I radioed dispatch to let them know I was entering the residence and stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt it. Something wasn't right. The air was unnaturally cold, and the lights flickered overhead. The house didn't appear abandoned. Family photos lined the walls, and personal belongings were scattered around, but the silence was oppressive. "Hello? Police? Is anyone here?" I called out, my voice echoing down the hallway. I moved cautiously, scanning each room as I passed. The house was a small two-story cottage. The decor was dated, but nothing seemed out of place at first. Then I reached the living room, and my stomach dropped. In the center of the room stood a man. He was tall, maybe in his mid-40s, and wore a dark, heavy jacket. He was facing away from me, completely still. "Sir?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing unease. "Are you all right? Can you hear me?" He didn't move. He didn't acknowledge me. He just stood there, staring at the wall. Something was deeply wrong. My instincts screamed at me to be cautious. I stepped closer, scanning the room for anything unusual. That's when I noticed his shadow. It wasn't normal. It stretched unnaturally across the floor, twisting and shifting in ways that defied logic. It moved independently, as though it were alive. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I pulled my gun, my hands trembling slightly. "Sir, I need you to turn around and speak to me," I said, trying to sound authoritative. Still nothing. I called for backup, my voice tight. "Dispatch, I need backup at 1340 Willow Creek Road. Possible hostile situation. Respond immediately." But the radio was dead, static, no response. The man slowly turned his head toward me, and that's when I saw his eyes. They were black, completely black. No whites, no pupils, just an empty void staring directly at me. "You're not supposed to be here," he whispered, his voice gravelly and unnatural. "Leave now." A chill ran through my body. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. "I'm not leaving until I know you're okay," I managed to say, though my voice wavered. The man stepped toward me, his shadow stretching further across the room, almost as if it were reaching for me. The air grew colder with each step he took. "You should have left when you had the chance," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Suddenly, the room felt suffocating, the air thick and heavy. I reached for my radio again, but it was useless. Panic set in. I raised my gun, trying to steady my shaking hands. "Stop right there," I shouted. "This is your last warning." He didn't stop. Instead, he took one more step and then, without warning, collapsed to the floor. I rushed to his side, my training kicking in. But when I touched him, his body was ice cold. Too cold. I checked for a pulse. Nothing. He wasn't breathing. He was dead. I backed away, my heart racing, unable to comprehend what had just happened. I couldn't explain how he'd gone from standing perfectly still to lifeless in a matter of seconds. Then it hit me, the woman. The one who had called in the disturbance. Where was she? There was no sign of her anywhere in the house. When backup finally arrived, they found nothing. No woman. No signs of a struggle. And no explanation for the man's death. The coroner's report was inconclusive. No heart failure, no stroke, nothing. It was as if his body had simply stopped. I haven't been able to forget that night. The black eyes, the moving shadow, the oppressive weight. In the air, it felt like something was watching me. Something not of this world. I've been back to that house a few times since then, but each time the same feeling of dread washes over me. I can't shake the sense that whatever was in that house isn't gone. It's still out there, waiting, watching. and one day I fear it might come back for me. I've been a police officer for over 10 years, and I've dealt with my fair share of terrifying situations, shootouts, violent confrontations, dangerous chases. But what happened at Station 14 that night is something I can never explain. It stuck with me in a way I can't shake. It was a cold winter evening, the kind where the air feels thin and biting, where the streets shimmer with frost and the sky seems to press down on you. The station was relatively quiet that night. I was working the midnight shift, and most of the officers were either out patrolling or finishing paperwork. The only sounds were the buzzing of the fluorescent lights, the occasional shuffle of footsteps down the hallway, and the hum of the old heating unit in the corner. I remember the clock reading 2 a.m. when the call came in. A local resident reported hearing strange noises coming from an old, abandoned building on the edge of town. It wasn't unusual for people to report odd sounds in the dead of night. Sometimes it was animals, sometimes just the wind. But this call had a specific, unnerving tone. The dispatcher mentioned reports of deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth. I grabbed my jacket, flashlight, and radio, then headed out. There were two things that made this call stand out. First, the building was an old, decaying structure that had been abandoned for years. It had no power, no reason for anyone to be inside. Second, it was located in a part of town known for its criminal activity. When things felt off in that area, they often were. As I drove through the frozen streets, the world outside seemed unnaturally still. No cars passed, no pedestrians. The entire neighborhood felt like it was frozen in time. When I reached the building, it loomed at the end of a forgotten street, its boarded-up windows and sagging roof giving it an ominous presence. The air was thick with an unsettling silence. I parked near the entrance, my boots crunching against the snow as I stepped out. The building hadn't been touched in decades, but one of the doors was hanging loosely off its hinges, leaving a gap just big enough to slip inside. My gut told me this wasn't just a stray animal. I approached cautiously, shining my flashlight through the gap. Inside, it was pitch black, except for the faintest flicker of light slipping through the broken boards. The air smelled damp, heavy with mildew and rot. My breath puffed visibly in the cold as I called out, "Hello, police, is anyone in here?" My voice echoed through the empty space, but there was no response, just the creaking of the building in the wind. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct telling me to turn back, but I pushed forward. I was trained for situations like this, even when they didn't feel right. I pulled the door open and slipped inside, my flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. The interior was as decayed as I'd imagined: peeling paint, broken furniture, debris scattered across the floor. But then I heard it. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was too calculated, too human. My heart began to race as I called it in. Unit 12 to dispatch. I've entered the building. I hear footsteps. Possible suspect inside. Requesting backup. The radio crackled, but no response came through. I tried again, pressing the button firmly. Dispatch, do you copy? I need backup now. Silence. The air grew colder, almost freezing, and the sound of the footsteps grew louder. They seemed to be just around the next corner, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. My breath quickened as I pressed forward, scanning every shadowed corner with my flashlight. Then I saw it. A figure stood at the end of the hallway. It wasn't moving, just standing there in the darkness. Its shape was humanoid but distorted, as if I were looking at it through warped glass. It was tall, at least 6 feet, and its outline was fuzzy, like an out-of-focus photograph. "Show yourself," I called out, my voice firm despite the fear clawing at my chest. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, like the weight of the world was pressing down on me. Something inside me screamed to run, but I forced myself to take a step forward. As soon as I did, the figure vanished. It didn't walk away. It didn't dissolve into the shadows. It simply ceased to exist. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Then, the footsteps started again, this time faster, as if whatever it was moving toward me. "Back up. Now," I yelled into my radio, desperation creeping into my voice. "I need backup at the old warehouse. There's something in here." Still no response. The static on the radio only amplified the dread pooling in my stomach. The footsteps grew louder, circling me, stalking me. My flashlight darted around the room, but there was nothing there, only shadows and decaying walls. Then I heard it. A whisper. Low, unintelligible, like a voice just out of reach. It wasn't words, it was more like a feeling, a vibration in the air. Panic overtook me. I turned and bolted for the door, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The whispers grew louder, and the air grew colder, biting into my skin. As I reached the entrance, I turned one last time. It was there. There. The figure stood just feet away, towering over me. Its head nearly touched the ceiling, and its form seemed to shift and blur like a heat mirage. Its face was indistinct, except for its eyes wide, hollow pits that stared straight into me. I didn't remember running out of the building. I didn't remember getting into my cruiser. But the next thing I knew, I was speeding back to the station, my hands shaking on the wheel. When investigators arrived the next morning, the building was empty. No footprints, no evidence of anyone being there. It was as if nothing had happened. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. That night haunts me. I can still feel those eyes on me, watching, waiting. I don't know what it was, and I don't think I ever will. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to that building. Whatever it wasn't human. Thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. I hope this story gave you chills. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. Give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you have your own spooky stories or topics you'd like us to cover, share them in the comments. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you in the next video. Stay safe, and remember, sometimes the truth is scarier than fiction. I've been working as a police officer for over 15 years now, and I thought I had seen everything the job had to offer, from robberies to homicides. I believed I was prepared for anything. But there's one case, one night, that still haunts me. It's a night I will never forget, and it's a story I rarely share because even now, I can't make sense of it. It was a typical night shift, cold and quiet in a small town in southern Colorado, where I was stationed. The streets were empty, except for a few stragglers leaving the local bar. My partner, Officer Martinez, and I had just finished responding to a couple of minor incidents. A suspicious vehicle in a parking lot, which turned out to be a teenager sneaking a cigarette, and some loud noises behind the grocery store that ended up being raccoons fighting over scraps. Standard stuff. As we cruised down Main Street around 3:30 a.m., we got a call from dispatch that changed everything. Unit 5, this is dispatch. We have a welfare check request at an address on the outskirts of town, came the calm voice of our dispatcher. Nothing about the call seemed urgent, just a request to check on an elderly woman who hadn't answered her phone or the door. But it struck me as odd for someone to report this in the middle of the night. We made our way out of town, taking the long stretch of highway toward the address. The area was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that only exists in rural parts of the country, where civilization feels like it's miles away. Finally, we pulled up to the house, a small, run-down cottage that looked like it hadn't been cared for in years. The windows were cracked, the yard overgrown with weeds, and the entire place seemed forgotten by time. Still, the front porch light was on, and the door was slightly ajar. Something about it didn't sit right with me. I got out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway, and Martinez followed, his hand resting on his holster. We approached the door cautiously, knocking once before calling out. "Mom, this is the police. Are you home?" I called. My voice echoed in the stillness, but there was no response. I knocked again, harder this time, but still nothing. Unease began to grow in my chest. I motioned for Martinez to check the side of the house while I circled around back. At first, we didn't expect anything dangerous, but the longer we went without an answer, the stranger the situation felt. As I moved around the back, I noticed all the windows were covered with heavy drapes, making it impossible to see inside. The back door was locked, and there were no signs of forced entry. Then, as I walked along the side of the house, I saw a faint light flickering from one of the windows. The curtains were drawn, but the light was bright enough to cast shifting shadows across the wall. I radioed Martinez to let him know about the light. Then, taking a deep breath, I decided to go inside. "All right, I'm coming in," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease in my gut. I pushed the front door open, the hinges creaking loudly as it swung inward. The living room was dimly lit and eerily still. The air inside was cold, despite the warm night outside. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing dusty furniture and scattered belongings that looked untouched for years. But something was off. The chairs in the living room were all perfectly aligned facing the door. The television, though turned off, was positioned directly in front of them. There was an unsettling symmetry to the room that sent a chill down my spine. "Mom, this is Officer Carter. Are you here?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. Still no response. I moved deeper into the house, the floor creaking beneath my boots. Passing through the living room, I noticed a faint light coming from the bedroom at the end of the hallway. My heart pounded as I approached, unsure of what I would find. The bedroom door was slightly open, and I could see a silhouette standing in the center of the room, perfectly still. At first glance, it looked like a person, but something wasn't right. The figure was tall and unnaturally thin, almost gaunt. It wore a long, dark coat that seemed too large for its frame, and its head was tilted slightly to the side, staring straight ahead without moving. "Ma'am," I called again, stepping closer. My hand instinctively went to my sidearm, though I didn't draw it. "Are you all right? You right?" As I entered the room, the coldness deepened, and the air felt heavy, pressing against my chest. The figure didn't move. Then, slowly, it turned its head toward me. I froze. Its eyes were completely black, no whites, no pupils, just empty voids that stared straight through me. A wave of cold swept over me, and for a moment I couldn't move or speak. The air grew thicker, suffocating, as though the room itself was alive and closing in on me. Then, as if breaking free from a trance, I stumbled backward out of the doorway. My hand remained on my gun, but I couldn't bring myself to draw it. The figure didn't follow, it just stood there, its empty gaze locked on me. I backed into the hallway, my heart racing. Martinez appeared, his face pale and confused. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. I don't know," I stammered. "Stay back." We both retreated toward the front door, neither of us daring to look back. The oppressive feeling lingered as we stepped outside into the cold night air. We didn't speak as we got into the car, and I immediately radioed dispatch, requesting another team to check the house. When other officers arrived later that morning, they found nothing. The house was empty, no lights, no furniture, and no trace of the elderly woman who was supposed to live there. It was as though everything we had seen was a figment of our imagination. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I've tried to rationalize it, but nothing fits. Some things, I've learned, can't be explained, and maybe they shouldn't be. All I know is that I will never forget those black, soulless eyes staring back at me. Whatever it was, it's still out there. And sometimes late at night, I wonder if it's waiting for me to come back. But I never will. I've been a cop in a small town in Texas for the last 20 years. You might think that a small town is a quiet place where the biggest issue is a couple of teenagers speeding down Main Street or someone's dog getting loose. But I can tell you, things can get downright terrifying in places like this. I'm not talking about the drunks we drag out of bars or the occasional meth head causing trouble. I'm talking about the cases that don't make sense, the ones that stick with you long after your shift is over, the ones you never talk about. This story takes place about 6 years ago, but I remember it like it happened yesterday. It was late October, and the nights were getting colder. My partner Rick and I were pulling another overnight shift. I didn't mind it much. Night shifts were usually quieter, with less paperwork and fewer people on the roads. But that night, something happened that still haunts me to this day. Around 1 a.m., we got the call. Dispatch told us there was a 911 hang-up from a remote farmhouse on the outskirts of town. Usually those calls are nothing, kids playing with the phone or someone accidentally hitting the emergency button. But protocol is protocol, so we had to check it out. The farmhouse was old, one of those big, two-story places you only see in horror movies. It had probably been a nice home once, but now it looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The paint was peeling off the walls, the windows were dusty, and the whole place gave off this vibe like it had been forgotten by time. There were no cars in the driveway and no lights on in the house. "Looks abandoned," Rick said as we pulled up. "Yeah, but someone made that call," I replied. "Let's check it out." We parked the cruiser at the end of the driveway, leaving the headlights on for light. The front gate hung off its hinges, creaking in the wind as we approached. The yard was overgrown with tall weeds that looked like they hadn't been cut in years. What struck me as odd was how cold it felt, like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees since we got out of the car. We made our way to the front door, and I gave it a couple of hard knocks. The sound echoed through the house, but there was no answer. I tried again, louder this time, but still nothing. "Let's take a look around back," I suggested. As we walked around the house, our flashlights caught something in the weeds. At first I thought it was a stray animal or maybe a raccoon, but then I realized it was a toy, a filthy, weather-worn stuffed teddy bear lying there, staring up at us with glassy eyes. "What's that doing out here?" Rick muttered, nudging it with his boot. I shrugged it off, but the sight of that bear unsettled me for some reason. We continued to the back porch, where we found a set of old wooden steps leading to a slightly ajar door, creaking as it swayed in the wind. "I'll go first," I told Rick, drawing my sidearm. The inside of the house smelled of mildew. The floorboards creaked under our weight, and the air was thick with dust. Our flashlights revealed old furniture covered in white sheets, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, and peeling wallpaper. "Hello? Anyone here?" I called out. No response. We started searching the house room by room. There was something off about the place, an oppressive atmosphere that made the air feel heavier. The deeper we went, the colder it got. We were halfway down a long hallway when we heard a faint, muffled sound, like someone crying. Rick and I exchanged a look and nodded toward a door at the end of the hall. The crying grew louder as we approached. It sounded like a woman, but there was something distorted about it, almost as if it were coming from an old tape recorder. My heart pounded as I reached for the doorknob. I pushed the door open with my gun drawn. The room was pitch black, containing only an old bed frame and broken furniture. The crying had stopped, leaving the room in eerie silence. "What the hell?" Rick whispered. Then we heard it again, the crying, but this time from upstairs, louder and more frantic. My skin crawled as we turned toward the staircase. "I don't like this, man," Rick said, his voice trembling. "Let's just check it out and get out of here," I replied, steadying my nerves. We climbed the stairs slowly, each step groaning under our weight. The crying grew louder until it was almost deafening. It came from the last door on the right. I was about to reach for the knob when the crying abruptly stopped. The silence was so complete it felt like the house was holding its breath. I pushed the door open, flashlight in hand. The room was empty, just like the one downstairs. "Are we going crazy?" Rick asked in a hushed voice. Before I could respond, we heard it again, this time right behind us. The sound of a woman sobbing, so close it was as if she were standing between us. We spun around, guns drawn, but there was nothing there. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice panicked. We bolted down the stairs, but as we reached the front door, it slammed shut with a force that shook the house. We tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge, as if something was holding it shut. "What the hell is happening?" Rick shouted, panic rising. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we needed to get out fast. We turned back to find another exit, and that's when we saw it. A shadowy figure at the end of the hallway, just standing there. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin arms stretching to the floor. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I felt its cold, unblinking gaze. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Rick's arm. We crashed through the back door and sprinted to the car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, but I finally started the engine, and we sped away. Back at the station, we tried to make sense of what had happened, but nothing added up. The farmhouse was supposed to be abandoned. No one had lived there for years, and yet the 911 call had come from that address. A week later, rookies sent to investigate found the house exactly as we described, abandoned and empty. But they did find one thing: an old cell phone lying in the living room. It had only one call logged in its history. The call was made at 1 a.m., the night we were there. That was 6 years ago. To this day, I can't drive past that farmhouse without a chill running down my spine. Some things are better left unexplained. C3. I've been a police officer for almost a decade, and I've seen the darker sides of humanity, the places where the sun doesn't shine. I've faced violence, despair, and the worst parts of human nature. But there's one case, one night, that still makes my skin crawl. It wasn't a murder, a robbery, or even a violent crime. It was something far more disturbing, something that still haunts me when the world falls silent. It was a cold, rainy night when I first got the call. I was working the night shift in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The streets were slick with rain, and the neon lights of the few open stores flickered under the downpour. It was the kind of night that felt muted, the kind that made you wonder if something or someone was watching. The call came in just after midnight. Unit 12, we've got a suspicious person reported on Elm Street near the alley behind the market. Caller didn't provide many details but sounded concerned. Can you respond? I was the closest unit, so I took it. Elm Street wasn't known for major crime, mostly petty thefts, and the occasional break-in. As I drove toward the location, I ran through the usual possibilities. Maybe a drunk, maybe a homeless person seeking shelter. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. When I turned onto Elm Street, the alley stretched before me, dimly lit by a few flickering streetlights. At the end of the block was the old market, its windows grimed streaked and its sign humming faintly in the rain. I parked my cruiser at the mouth of the alley, my headlights cutting through the darkness, and stepped out into the wet night. The rain muffled the usual sounds of the city, making everything feel unnaturally quiet. I pulled out my flashlight and began walking down the alley, my boots crunching softly against the wet pavement. The beam of my flashlight swept through the darkness, but it seemed to reveal nothing, just shadows and the glint of rain-slicked surfaces. Near the back entrance of the market, I spotted a figure hunched in the shadows, completely still. At first, I thought it might be someone waiting for a ride or taking shelter, but something about the way they stood made me stop. It wasn't natural. "Oh. Hey," I called out, keeping my tone professional. "Are you all right? What are you doing out here?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. I stepped closer, my grip tightening on my flashlight. My instincts were on high alert. "Unit 12 to dispatch," I said, my voice low as I keyed the mic. "I've got a possible person in distress in the alley, requesting backup." As soon as I radioed in, the figure shifted. Slowly. Unnaturally, they turned their head toward me, and that's when I saw their eyes. Or rather, the lack of them. There were two hollow pits where eyes should have been black voids that seemed to swallow the light. The skin on their face was pale and stretched too tightly over their skull, giving them an almost skeletal appearance. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to take a step forward. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked again, though my voice trembled. They didn't answer. Instead, they began to move, but not like a normal person. It was as if they were gliding, their feet barely touching the ground, hovering just above the wet pavement. My blood ran cold. I reached for my gun, my hand trembling, but before I could draw it, the figure jerked its head toward me so fast, so sudden, that I barely had time to react. Then it whispered, its voice a low hiss that seemed to echo inside my head rather than in the alley. "You shouldn't be here." The words sent a chill down my spine, colder than the rain soaking through my uniform. I've faced dangerous situations before, but this was different. This didn't feel human. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on the figure. The rain was falling harder now, the sound drowning out everything but the pounding of my own heart. I turned, fumbling for my radio to call for backup again, but when I looked back, the figure was gone. Vanished. One moment it was there, staring at me with those empty eyes, and the next it was as if it had never been. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I ran back to my car, my hands shaking as I locked the doors and gripped the steering wheel. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to process what had just happened. "Dispatch," I called into the radio, but it crackled with static, giving me nothing. No response. I sat in the car for what felt like an eternity, rain tapping against the roof as I stared at the mouth of the alley. Eventually, backup arrived. 2 officers searched the area thoroughly, but they found nothing. No sign of the figure. No evidence of anything out of the ordinary. Just an empty, rain-soaked alley. When I explained what I'd seen, my partner suggested it might have been someone high on drugs or hallucinating, but I knew better. Deep down, I knew what I'd seen wasn't human. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those hollow pits where eyes should have been, staring at me from the shadows. Over the next week, I went back to the alley a few times, hoping to find some kind of explanation. Each time it was the same silent, empty ordinary, except for that lingering feeling like something was there, just out of sight. I never went back after that. I still avoid Elm Street whenever I'm on duty, and every time I hear a call about a suspicious person in that area. A chill runs down my spine, because I know whatever it was I encountered that night, it's still out there, waiting